He thought it was just a strange hill in the desert, but when the explorer began digging, gold glinted beneath the sand. That's how he uncovered a secret that had been hidden for 2,000 years. Inside the pyramid, something awaited him that would change everything. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Daniel had always carried with him a quiet restlessness, the kind that gnawed at the edges of a man's soul when he knew he was meant for more than the life he led. From his earliest memories, he had felt a magnetic pull towards stories of forgotten civilizations, sunken temples, and buried treasures. While other boys his age had been fascinated by ball games or tinkering with machines, he found himself in the corner of libraries, tracing his fingers along the faded maps of distant lands, staring at illustrations of ancient monuments, imagining himself as one of those fearless explorers who stumbled upon wonders that had been lost to time. Those childhood fascinations never left him, though the responsibilities of adulthood had tethered him to a more ordinary life. By profession, Daniel was a geologist, a steady job that paid his bills and lent him an air of respectability. Yet it was hardly the kind of work that ignited his spirit. Day after day he measured soil samples, studied mineral compositions, and cataloged the slow, unromantic rhythms of the earth. He was good at his work, meticulous even, but each time he packed away his equipment at the end of a shift, he felt that he had left something undone. His colleagues often teased him for his tendency to drift into daydreams, for the way his gaze would wander toward the horizon, as though he could see through mountains and deserts to the secrets hidden within. Though he had no advanced degrees in archaeology or the prestige of published discoveries, Daniel compensated with curiosity, persistence, and a stubborn refusal to believe that all the great mysteries had already been unearthed. He spent his free time studying ancient texts translated into English, learning about forgotten trade routes, and poring over maps that combined both geological surveys and the faint outlines of myths. He knew he was not the first to walk these paths, but he hoped he might be the first in centuries to see what others had overlooked. It was on one such solitary outing that his life began to change. He had developed the habit of venturing out to isolated places on weekends, carrying little more than a pack with water, a notebook, and a small set of tools. Unlike the expeditions mounted by universities and institutions, Daniel's searches were humble, almost primitive in their simplicity. He was not driven by wealth or fame. Instead, he sought the satisfaction of knowing he had followed a clue, however faint, into the wilderness. The landscapes of the world had always felt to him like an enormous puzzle, each odd formation or unusual rise in the earth another piece waiting to be placed. On a dry and cloudless afternoon with the desert sun beating down relentlessly, he found himself wandering across a barren stretch of land not far from a ridge he had once studied for its mineral content. He had not planned this particular walk, but something had urged him to turn his steps towards the flat expanse of ground beyond the ridge. The silence there was almost unnatural, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. It was then, as he wiped the sweat from his brow, that his eyes caught upon something peculiar. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a hillock rising gently from the otherwise level plain. Such formations were not uncommon, often created by centuries of wind and shifting sand. Yet something about its symmetry unsettled him. The slope of the mound was too precise, its angles too consistent to be the careless work of nature. Daniel narrowed his eyes, tilting his head as he slowly circled it, his instincts quickening. He crouched low, scooping a handful of earth into his palm, letting the fine grains slip between his fingers. There was nothing unusual about the soil itself, but the shape of the mound gnawed at him. Pulling out his notebook, he began to sketch the outline as he saw it, marking its coordinates and comparing it with the topographical maps he carried folded at the back of his journal. The feature was not listed anywhere. There were no notes of any survey having recognized it, no symbols to indicate an archaeological site. Yet here it was, rising before him like an enigma. He walked its perimeter again, this time counting his steps, and confirmed what his eyes already told him. The mound was too perfect. It resembled the truncated top of a structure, one that had been smothered by centuries of drifting sand and dust. As he stood there, the sun sliding lower toward the horizon, Daniel felt his heart thudding with a familiar but sharper rhythm. He had stumbled upon something unusual before, a weathered shard of pottery, the hint of an old foundation, but nothing that spoke so strongly of human hands shaping the land. The possibility that he had discovered a hidden structure thrilled him, but it also filled him with caution. He had no illusions about the dangers of digging where he was not authorized. Looters, opportunists, and careless amateurs had ruined countless sites across the world. Still, the compulsion that stirred within him would not be silenced. That night, long after he had returned home, Daniel could not sleep. He replayed every detail of the mound in his mind, picturing its lines, its size, the way it sat alone against the plain like a sentinel. He spread his maps across the kitchen table, his lamp burning into the early hours of morning, searching for any hint of prior mention. There was none. The idea that he might have discovered something forgotten by time, perhaps buried deliberately, refused to release its grip. In the days that followed, he found himself returning again and again to the site, each time with a little more resolve, a little more preparation. At first, he brought nothing but his hands and a small trowel, gently brushing away at the surface. Later, he returned with sturdier tools, shovels, and measuring rods. He was cautious, careful not to dig too deep or too wide, marking every inch he uncovered. What he found both frightened and exhilarated him. Just beneath the crust of earth, the mound gave way to something solid, unnaturally smooth. And when the light of the sun caught it at the right angle, it gleamed faintly. It was metal, but not the corroded iron or bronze he might have expected. The sheen was warmer, richer, unmistakable. It was gold. At first, he thought it must be a coincidence, perhaps a gilded stone or some mineral anomaly. But the more he uncovered, the more his hands trembled with certainty. This was no accident of geology. He had stumbled upon something man-made, and it was made of gold. Daniel sat back on his heels, staring at the shining surface that now stretched wider than his arms could span. It was not just a plate, nor a scattering of fragments. It was part of something larger, something buried beneath his feet. He traced its lines with his fingers, finding edges too precise for nature, angles too deliberate. His breath came shallow as the truth began to form in his mind. This was not a mound. It was the peak of a structure, one deliberately hidden beneath the sands of time. And if his instincts were right, if his childhood fascination with ancient monuments had prepared him for anything, then he had just uncovered the first glimpse of a pyramid buried in the earth. For a long while he sat there in silence, the desert wind whispering around him, as the weight of the discovery settled upon his shoulders. He knew then that his life would never be the same. The restlessness that had haunted him was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose sharper than anything he had known. He had found something extraordinary, and whatever secrets it held, he would be the one to uncover them. And so, with the fading light casting long shadows over the plain, Daniel rose, his eyes fixed upon the gleaming fragment of gold. He would return, better prepared. He would dig deeper. He would unravel the mystery of the hidden pyramid, no matter how long it took. That night, as he lay awake, listening to the echoes of his own heartbeat, he understood what explorers of old must have felt when they stumbled upon their first great discoveries. It was the beginning of something larger than himself, larger than his quiet life of routine. He did not know yet whether it would bring him glory, danger, or ruin. All he knew was that the sands of the desert had whispered their secret to him alone, and he could not turn away. The days that followed Daniel's initial encounter with the golden glimmer beneath the soil were restless ones. His mind, once filled with the familiar rhythm of geological surveys and academic tedium, now pulsed with a singular obsession. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it was interrupted by vivid dreams of endless sands parting to reveal towering structures of gold. He awoke each morning with the taste of dust on his tongue and the memory of the mound etched sharply into his mind. Every thought circled back to the place where sunlight had caught on metal, gleaming in quiet defiance of the centuries that had buried it. He prepared himself with as much subtlety as he could. There were no colleagues he could confide in, no institutions he could turn to without fear of being dismissed as fanciful, or, worse, of losing the discovery to more powerful hands. He moved quietly, gathering what tools he could afford from hardware stores and second-hand shops: sturdy shovels, a handpick, brushes, gloves, ropes, and most importantly, a lantern of reliable strength. It was not much, nothing like the equipment of professional archaeological teams, but it was enough to let him dig further into the mystery that had seized him. When he returned to the site, the desert lay in its familiar silence, stretching out under the pitiless sun. The mound was there, waiting, its shape no less strange to him despite how many times he had sketched it, how many times he had walked its perimeter. Kneeling at the spot where he had first uncovered the metallic surface, he set his tools down with deliberate care, as though performing a ritual. The first clump of soil came away with a dull scrape, the sound of spade against grit echoing in the emptiness. Beneath it, the golden surface reappeared, its luster dimmed by dust, but unmistakable in its richness. Daniel worked steadily, each layer of earth yielding to his persistence. The mound seemed to resist him as though reluctant to give up its secret, but he pressed on. As the hours passed, the sun burned overhead, sweat dripped into his eyes and his muscles ached, yet the sight before him drove him onward. Slowly, a broader section of the surface came into view. The lines were too perfect, the edges too sharp. This was no scattered deposit of ore, no coincidence of mineral formation. It was part of something deliberately built. Kneeling closer, he brushed away soil with his bare hands, fingertips running along the smooth plane. The texture was cool despite the heat, unnervingly even. His breath caught when his fingers traced a precise edge, leading him along a straight line that disappeared once again into the earth. He followed it, digging furiously now, until the full corner revealed itself, sharp and undeniable. His suspicion hardened into certainty. This was a structure, and what he had uncovered was not merely a fragment but the crown of something immense, perhaps the very apex of a buried pyramid. The thought stole the air from his lungs. A pyramid here, in this forgotten stretch of land, smothered by centuries of sandstorms and neglect. He sat back, chest heaving, staring at the shining corner with awe and disbelief. How could such a thing exist without record, without legend strong enough to survive into the present day? He had read enough history to know the patterns of human memory, Monuments of this scale left marks upon culture, became the bones of myth. Yet here was a pyramid, glimmering beneath his touch, and no whisper of it had reached his ears until he had stumbled across it by chance. Daniel pressed on, alternating between careful brushing and heavier digging. The earth gave way reluctantly, but inch by inch the shape expanded. What he saw was staggering. The surface was not rough or crumbling, but immaculate. Its golden blocks fitted together with such precision that he could not slip the edge of his trowel between them. The craftsmanship spoke of a knowledge beyond his imagination, a civilization with the skill and wealth to command resources on a scale he could hardly fathom. At one point, as he cleared more soil, his lantern beam caught upon faint markings etched into the surface. Leaning closer, he realized they were symbols, carved with deliberate care into the golden stone. They were unlike any script he recognized, neither hieroglyphs of Egypt nor cuneiform of Mesopotamia, but something wholly alien, a hybrid language of shapes and curves that defied his attempts at interpretation. The sight of them made his pulse quicken. Symbols were a voice from the past, and if he could decipher them, they might tell him who had built this pyramid and why it had been hidden. But even more pressing than the symbols was the realization of scale. Every corner he uncovered only hinted at the vastness still concealed below. This was no small chamber, no hidden chest of gold, but a monument buried beneath his feet. He imagined its weight pressing up through the ground, centuries of silence sealing it away until his spade had disturbed its slumber. The thought made him both exhilarated and uneasy. He paused, sitting in the shallow trench he had carved, letting his gaze wander across the desolate plain. The desert spread outward in every direction, indifferent and eternal. It struck him then how utterly alone he was. No eyes had witnessed what he was seeing. No records existed of the golden surface he now brushed free. He felt as though he stood on the threshold of history itself, balanced between discovery and danger. One word whispered itself into his mind, repeating with the rhythm of his heartbeat: treasure. Yet it did not feel like the treasure of stories, the simple lure of wealth. There was something deeper, almost sacred, in the gleam of the golden stones. Whoever had built this had not done so lightly. He thought of ancient rulers who demanded monuments to their glory, of priests who raised temples in devotion to their gods, of civilizations who left behind grand works as proof of their existence. But this pyramid was different. It had been hidden, smothered beneath sand and time, as though the builders had not wished for it to be seen. That secrecy unsettled him even more than the discovery itself. As dusk began to fall, Daniel finally forced himself to stop. He gathered his tools, brushing dust from his clothes, though his eyes lingered upon the gleaming surface until the last possible moment. The desert air grew cool, the horizon glowing faintly with the colors of sunset, yet he remained rooted in thought. The golden pyramid had revealed only a fraction of itself, and he could feel its weight tugging at his soul. He knew he would return tomorrow and the next day, and every day he could, until he had uncovered the truth. That night, back in his modest home, he spread his notes across the table, candlelight flickering upon hastily drawn sketches of the corner and its markings. He tried to match the symbols with anything he had studied before, flipping through books and online archives, but nothing resembled them. The lines were unique, enigmatic, and they seemed almost to shift when he stared too long. He closed the book with a sigh, his hands trembling with fatigue and wonder. Lying in bed, he felt the exhaustion seep into his body, but his mind refused to rest. He replayed the sight of the golden corner, the way it had glowed even beneath centuries of dirt. The thought struck him that the structure beneath might still be intact, preserved by the very sand that had hidden it. What secrets, what relics might lie inside? The question consumed him, drawing him further into obsession. Sleep came only in fitful bursts, filled with dreams of chambers lit by golden light and echoes of forgotten voices calling from the depths. By the time dawn broke, he was already on his feet, gathering his tools once more. The discovery had taken hold of him, reshaping his days and nights into a single mission. He could no longer think of soil samples, of ordinary duties, or the mundane concerns of daily life. The pyramid demanded his attention, its mystery pressing into every corner of his thoughts. As he stepped out into the rising sun, the desert air cool against his face, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever lay ahead, whether it was ruin, revelation, or both, he knew he was bound to it now. The first discovery had been made, the veil of earth lifted just enough to show him what waited below. There was no turning back. The golden pyramid had chosen him, and he would dig until it yielded its truth. The morning after his second long day of digging, Daniel awoke with his body sore, his muscles stiff from the unaccustomed labor, yet his mind more alive than it had been in years. The shimmering surface of the golden stone would not leave him. It was burned into his vision, lingering behind his eyes whenever he blinked. He ate a hurried breakfast, though he barely tasted it, his thoughts already racing ahead to the desert, to the mound, to the puzzle that had wrapped itself so tightly around him. It was no longer simply a curiosity. It had become a calling. He gathered his tools with greater urgency now, no longer content with a small trowel and brushes. He purchased larger shovels, a sturdier pickaxe, thick gloves, and a canvas tarp to protect the site from the wind once he left it each evening. He bought rope, too, not knowing whether he would need to descend into hidden depths, but unwilling to risk being unprepared. His savings dwindled quickly, but he hardly noticed. Each purchase felt like an investment not in tools, but in destiny. The desert greeted him with the same stillness as before, the same oppressive heat and silence that seemed to hold its breath. The mound rose ahead of him like a sentinel, unchanged, indifferent, yet charged with significance now that he knew what glimmered beneath. He set to work immediately, driving his shovel into the ground with a force born of obsession. Dust billowed with every strike, clinging to his sweat-dampened skin, filling his nostrils and throat. He labored steadily, pausing only to sip from his water flask before pressing on again. As the hours stretched, more of the pyramid revealed itself. The corner he had uncovered expanded outward, the golden surface stretching farther in both directions, its sharp angles unyielding, its precision uncanny. Each block was seamless, fitted so tightly against its neighbors that not even a sliver of dust seemed to slip between them. Daniel could scarcely comprehend how such construction had been achieved, or why it had been buried so thoroughly. The perfection of the work both awed and unsettled him. It was as if the builders had possessed knowledge lost to time, skills beyond what he had believed possible for the ancient world. The deeper he dug, the clearer the mound's unnatural shape became. What he had taken for an ordinary rise of earth was slowly transforming before his eyes into the distinct outline of a pyramid, its sides sloping with deliberate geometry. The mound was no accident of shifting sands. It was a deliberate burial, a concealment of something monumental. The realization thrilled him, yet it also sent a shiver through his spine. Who had gone to such lengths to hide it? By the third day of digging, exhaustion gnawed at him. His arms ached, his hands blistered, yet he pressed on. The sun beat down mercilessly, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat, but the sight of each new surface spurred him forward. He began to uncover markings carved into the stone, patterns of spirals and interlocking lines, symbols that looked like writing but belonged to no language he recognized. He traced them with his fingers, marveling at their sharpness, as though the engravings had been etched only yesterday rather than centuries ago. At night, back in his modest home, he attempted to replicate the markings in his notebook. He drew them carefully, line by line, and searched through every book and article he owned, but none matched. They were not hieroglyphs, not Greek, not any known script. It was as though he had stumbled upon a forgotten tongue, one that had died with the civilization that built the Golden Pyramid. The thought of it filled him with wonder, but also with unease. A language lost to history meant a people lost as well, erased so completely that only this hidden monument remained. His life outside the excavation began to unravel. He stopped attending meetings at work, calling in sick, or simply vanishing without explanation. Friends reached out, but he ignored their messages, unable to tear his thoughts from the pyramid. His evenings were consumed with maps, symbols, and half-formed theories. He ate little, slept less, and lived only for the moment when he could return to the mound. The desert became his world, the pyramid his sole obsession. With each new day of digging, his trench grew deeper and wider, the pyramid's form rising from the earth like a giant emerging from slumber. The air around the site felt different now, charged with an energy he could not name. Sometimes, when the wind swept across the plain, he imagined it carried whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices rising from the depths. He shook the thought away, blaming exhaustion and heat, but the feeling lingered all the same. On the fifth day, his shovel struck something hollow. The sound echoed differently, sharp and resonant, unlike the solid clang of stone. Daniel froze, heart pounding, then scraped away the soil more carefully. A seam appeared, a narrow line running along the golden surface. He brushed it clean, and realization struck him. It was not just a wall, but a door, sealed and buried. His breath caught as he traced the outline, a rectangle nearly his own height, fitted so perfectly into the wall that it was invisible until revealed by his hands. The discovery left him trembling. A door meant passage, and passage meant chambers within. The mound was not merely a buried monument, it was hollow, a structure with rooms waiting in darkness. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. He had no idea what lay inside, treasure, relics, perhaps even remains, but he knew it was something deliberately hidden, sealed away with intention. Whoever had built this pyramid had wanted it forgotten. That night, Daniel could hardly sit still. He paced his small home, replaying the discovery in his mind. He considered calling authorities, museums, universities, but the thought of losing the site, of being cast aside while others claimed his find, filled him with dread. He resolved to go on alone, to press further until he had uncovered enough to prove the pyramid's significance beyond doubt. It was dangerous, perhaps reckless, but he could not turn away now. The excavation consumed him entirely. His days blurred into one long continuum of digging, brushing, and recording, his body weakening even as his resolve hardened. The door became his focus, every hour spent clearing its outline, every night devoted to imagining what lay beyond it. The deeper he went, the more certain he became that this was no mere tomb or temple. The pyramid pulsed with purpose, its golden walls whispering of secrets too long buried. One evening, As he brushed the last of the soil from the door's surface, Daniel sat back and stared at it in silence. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, painting the desert in hues of red and gold, but he saw only the door gleaming faintly in the dying light. His heart raced with anticipation, his hands trembling with the urge to push, to enter, to finally breach the mystery that had consumed his every thought. He knew he was on the threshold of something immense. The mound was no longer a mound. It was a pyramid, golden and silent, waiting for him to open its secrets. And though fear gnawed at him, whispering of dangers and curses, his resolve was unshaken. The excavation had only begun, and Daniel knew with absolute certainty that he would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Daniel could no longer ignore the truth that lay before him. The outline of the door he had uncovered shimmered faintly in the fading sunlight, the golden surface catching every last ray before nightfall swallowed the desert. He sat in the dust, with his chest heaving, his hands trembling from fatigue, but his mind was alert and burning with anticipation. The excavation had been arduous, and yet it had led him here, to the unmistakable threshold of something vast. He had spent days peeling away the sand and grit of centuries, and now he was face to face with an entrance that had been sealed since long before his ancestors had walked the earth. The discovery electrified him, filling him with both triumph and dread. He spent that night tossing on his narrow bed, the image of the door haunting him with every blink. The silence of his small home seemed oppressive, the darkness too complete. Every creak of wood and every gust of wind through the window shutters made him imagine distant voices, whispers that might have followed him back from the desert. He told himself it was only exhaustion, but deep down he felt that some kind of invisible threshold had already been crossed. He was no longer an observer of history, but a participant in it, and the pyramid seemed to have noticed him. At dawn, he returned to the site with renewed urgency, his pack heavy with ropes, chisels, his lantern, and a crowbar. The desert was cool in the early light, the sand whispering beneath his boots as he retraced his familiar path to the mound. The air felt charged, as though the land itself was holding its breath. When he reached the door, he crouched before it like a pilgrim before a shrine, pressing his gloved hands against the gleaming surface. The stone was cold, unyielding, yet he thought he could feel a faint vibration beneath his fingertips, a pulse buried in the silence. Working carefully, he ran the crowbar along the seam, testing for weakness. The edges were nearly invisible, fitted so seamlessly that he doubted any tool could pry them apart. Still, he tried, pressing his weight against the bar until his muscles strained, but the door remained resolute. He leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air, and studied the markings he had uncovered near the seam. They wound along the frame like guardians, abstract shapes intertwined with spirals and jagged lines. He wondered if they were instructions or warnings, a language meant for those who dared to enter. The day wore on as he experimented with different approaches. He scraped away the surrounding soil to expose the base, hoping to find leverage, but the pyramid's builders had planned too well. It was not until late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the desert, that he noticed something he had missed. Near the lower corner of the door, hidden beneath layers of hardened dirt, was a small depression, shallow and circular, no larger than his palm. Brushing it clean, he saw faint grooves etched into the shape of a sunburst. It was not a handle, not in the conventional sense, but it was deliberate. He placed his hand against it, and the coolness of the stone made him shiver. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, he felt the surface shift beneath his touch. A faint grinding noise rose from within the pyramid, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet it carried the weight of centuries. He drew his hand back in shock, his heart pounding, but the sound faded, leaving only silence once more. Trembling, he pressed his hand against the depression again, and this time the noise was louder, accompanied by the faintest shudder beneath his feet. Daniel staggered back as a thin line of darkness appeared along the seam of the door. Dust trickled from above, and a sliver of blackness widened slowly, achingly, as though the pyramid itself were reluctant to yield. The grinding grew louder, echoing across the plain, until finally the door shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. A gust of stale air rushed out, dry and suffocating, carrying with it the scent of dust and age. It struck his face like the breath of something ancient awakening after a long slumber. Fear and exhilaration warred within him. He had expected resistance, yet the pyramid had responded as if it had been waiting for his hand. He shone his lantern into the opening, but the light barely penetrated the darkness beyond. The narrow gap revealed nothing, only an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow the beam. He pressed harder against the door, straining with all his strength, and slowly, agonizingly, it gave way, grinding inward until there was just enough space for him to slip through. He hesitated at the threshold, the weight of the moment pressing down upon him. Once he crossed, there would be no turning back. He took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of his pack, and ducked into the opening. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of centuries undisturbed. The silence was absolute, so profound it rang in his ears. His lantern beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls of golden stone stretching into the shadows. The passageway was narrow, its floor littered with fine dust that billowed around his boots. Every step felt monumental, as though he was intruding upon a sacred space. He moved slowly, brushing his light across the walls. Symbols and carvings covered every surface, intricate patterns that seemed to shift in meaning depending on the angle of the light. Some resembled constellations, others the outlines of animals or figures in ceremonial poses. He paused often to trace them with his fingers, marveling at their preservation. The dryness of the desert had kept them intact, untouched by rot or decay. It was as if the pyramid had been waiting all this time for someone to see them again. The corridor led him deeper, sloping gently downward into the earth. The temperature dropped with each step, the coolness settling into his bones. His breath echoed against the walls, loud in the oppressive stillness. He tried to calm his racing thoughts, reminding himself to remain focused, but the sheer weight of what he was experiencing threatened to overwhelm him. He was inside a golden pyramid, a structure no one alive had ever seen, and it was larger and more complex than he had dared to imagine. After what felt like an eternity, the corridor widened into a small antechamber. His lantern revealed low benches carved from stone, their surfaces etched with more symbols. Broken shards of pottery lay scattered on the floor, along with what appeared to be fragments of bronze tools, green with age but still recognizable. Daniel crouched to examine them, his fingers trembling as he realized he was holding relics that had not been touched for thousands of years. The thought sent shivers down his spine. At the far end of the chamber, another passageway yawned open, leading further into the depths. He rose to his feet, his lantern trembling in his grasp, and stepped forward. The darkness ahead seemed almost alive, pressing against the edges of his light, daring him to venture further. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, but his resolve did not falter. He had crossed the threshold, and now there was no choice but to go on. The pyramid had opened its doors to him, and within its golden walls lay secrets that had waited millennia to be uncovered. What he would find next, he could not yet imagine, but he knew with unshakable certainty that his life had shifted irrevocably. There was no turning back. The entrance had been breached, and the true heart of the pyramid awaited. The deeper Daniel pressed into the golden labyrinth, the more his senses sharpened, every nerve pulled taut by anticipation and unease. The air was heavier now, colder, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of dust that had lain undisturbed for centuries. His lantern swung gently in his grasp, throwing shifting patterns of light and shadow along the walls as he advanced. Each flicker revealed new carvings, strange symbols, figures locked in ceremonial gestures, and lines that resembled maps of constellations. The pyramid was speaking to him in a language he did not understand, and yet the message felt urgent, as though every wall whispered fragments of a story meant for him alone. The corridor widened gradually, the walls expanding into a vast space that swallowed the glow of his lantern. Daniel froze at the threshold, his heart hammering in his chest as his mind tried to grasp the sheer size of what lay before him. He lifted his lantern higher, its beam falling upon shapes that glimmered faintly in the darkness. Slowly, the immensity of the chamber revealed itself, and his breath caught in his throat. He had stepped into a hall of wonders, a place that seemed too extravagant, too impossible to exist beneath the barren sands. Treasures lay scattered across the stone floor, heaped into piles and arranged upon pedestals. Golden masks with solemn, inhuman expressions stared back at him from hollow eyes. Statues of animals, some familiar, others strange hybrids of beast and man, gleamed in the lantern light, their surfaces polished smooth as though they had only just been crafted. Ornate jewelry spilled from broken chest, necklaces strung with gemstones that pulsed with inner fire, rings and bracelets that glittered like stars against the dimness. Every surface seemed alive with wealth, yet it was not merely wealth for its own sake. The treasures had been placed here with purpose, as offerings, as symbols of devotion. Daniel stepped forward with trembling legs, the crunch of dust beneath his boots sounding deafening in the silence. His light swept across the chamber, illuminating more wonders. Bronze weapons with intricate hilts, their blades still sharp despite their age, lay propped against the walls. Gilded urns, their sides carved with scenes of processions and rituals, lined the edges of the room. He moved closer to one of the pedestals and saw a crown resting atop it. A delicate circlet of gold, studded with red and blue stones, its design unlike anything he had ever seen in history books. It seemed both regal and alien, as though it had belonged to a king whose people had vanished without leaving their name. But among the heaps of treasures, one object drew his eye more than any other. Resting upon a raised platform in the very center of the hall was a pendant unlike the rest. It was large, carved from a translucent mineral that seemed to glow faintly even without the light of his lantern. At its core swirled a shimmer of colors, a strange luminescence that shifted when he moved, as though alive. The pendant was set in a frame of gold, inscribed with symbols that mirrored those carved upon the walls. Daniel's breath quickened as he approached it, for in his heart he knew instinctively this was no mere ornament. It was a key, though to what he could not yet say. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above its surface, but hesitated. The weight of the chamber pressed upon him as though unseen eyes were watching his every movement. He lowered his hand slowly and instead turned his attention to the walls, letting the lantern trace the carvings more carefully. Here, he saw figures bearing treasures into the hall, laying them at the feet of a towering man draped in a robe of gold. His face was obscured, his features hidden behind a mask, but his presence radiated power. Around him, others knelt in worship, their hands raised in devotion. The scene repeated itself across multiple panels, always with the masked figure at the center. Daniel felt a chill ripple through him. This hall was not just a vault, it was a temple of memory, a shrine erected to honor a leader or deity whose identity had been lost to time. The treasures were not gathered in greed, but in reverence, offerings meant to secure favor or preserve legacy. He wondered whether the pendant had been the central object of devotion, perhaps believed to contain divine power or a connection to the cosmos. His geologist's mind resisted the thought, but another part of him, the dreamer, the seeker, was willing to believe. As he explored further, his lantern revealed murals depicting journeys across deserts and seas, of caravans carrying salt and stone, of ships laden with goods bound for distant ports. These people had been traders, navigators, builders of empire. Yet their story had ended here, entombed beneath the sand with their riches. He could not help but wonder what had happened to them. Had they fallen to war, to famine, to time itself? Or had they chosen to vanish, hiding their greatest works from the eyes of the world? Kneeling beside a golden mask, Daniel picked it up carefully, marveling at its craftsmanship. The metal was thin yet strong, shaped into the visage of a man with wide, unblinking eyes. He held it up to his face, feeling its chill against his skin, and imagined the ceremonies it must have witnessed. He set it down quickly, shuddering at the thought of wearing another man's visage, a man long dead but whose presence lingered in the hall. The silence pressed upon him again, and for the first time he realized he was not only overwhelmed by awe, but by a growing unease. The treasures, dazzling as they were, seemed almost too pristine. The air was too still, the arrangement too deliberate. It felt less like a tomb robbed of life and more like a place waiting for its next visitor. His gaze was drawn once more to the glowing pendant in the center of the hall. He felt certain that it was not simply an object of wealth, but the key to understanding the pyramid itself. He forced himself to step back, steadying his breathing. He reminded himself that the true heart of the pyramid lay deeper still. The Hall of Treasures was a threshold, a place meant to awe and perhaps to test. The pendant's light continued to pulse softly, a reminder that the pyramid's story was far from finished. Daniel turned toward the far end of the hall, where another passage yawned open, darker and narrower than before. The treasures at his back glimmered in the lantern's retreating glow, silent and watchful, as though reluctant to let him go. He glanced back once more at the pendant, then tore his eyes away and stepped into the passage. The Hall of Treasures had revealed much, but it had also deepened the mystery. For Daniel, there could be no turning back. He carried with him the memory of riches beyond imagination, but also the certainty that the pyramid's greatest secret still awaited, sealed within the depths of stone and silence. Ahead lay the unknown, and he would face it, no matter the cost. The passage narrowed again as Daniel left behind the glittering chamber of treasures, his lantern's glow trembling against the walls as though uncertain it belonged there. The silence was deeper in this new corridor, more suffocating, and though he tried to steady his breathing, every sound he made seemed amplified, echoing through the golden stone like a trespasser's confession. The images of the hall remained vivid in his mind. The masks, the weapons, the impossible wealth, but more than anything, the glowing pendant haunted him. He could still see its light flickering even when his eyes closed, as though it had burned itself into his very thoughts. Yet the pyramid called him onward, and he obeyed. The air grew colder as he descended further, the dust thicker, clinging to his clothes and skin. The walls here bore fewer carvings, as if the builders had deemed this place too sacred or too dangerous to decorate with narrative. The stillness pressed upon him with every step, and for the first time Daniel wondered if he had gone too far. But curiosity, stronger than caution, urged him forward. He had passed the threshold of wealth and worship. Now he was entering the heart of something far greater. The passage ended suddenly, opening into a vast chamber that dwarfed even the Hall of Treasures. Daniel froze at the threshold, his lantern struggling to illuminate its immensity. The floor stretched wide before him, perfectly smooth, and the ceiling soared high into darkness. In the center of the chamber rose a single monolithic shape, a block of stone, so immense it seemed to anchor the entire pyramid around it. As Daniel stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a sarcophagus, towering and imposing, carved from a black stone that shimmered faintly under his lantern's light, veins of gold running like lightning across its surface. He approached slowly, each step hesitant, his eyes tracing the intricate carvings that covered the sarcophagus. Symbols coiled around its sides, winding in endless loops, some familiar from the walls of the pyramid, others entirely new. They seemed alive in the flickering light, twisting and shifting as if mocking his inability to understand them. At its base, golden panels depicted processions of figures carrying offerings, kneeling before the sarcophagus as though worshipping what lay within. The sheer presence of the monument made him shiver. It was not a coffin, not merely a container for the dead. It was a statement of power, a message carved in stone to echo across millennia. Daniel set his lantern on the floor, its glow casting long shadows up the sides of the sarcophagus, and circled it slowly. The craftsmanship was flawless, the stone polished smooth, the golden veins glimmering like frozen rivers of light. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, the sense that he was in the presence of something both profoundly human and utterly beyond his comprehension. His mind raced with possibilities. Could this be the resting place of the masked figure depicted in the hall? A king whose empire had vanished without a name? Or was it something older still, a relic of a people lost before history began? His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the stone. It was cold, colder than the air around it, and the chill seeped into his skin, making him recoil instinctively. He drew a deep breath and tried again, this time keeping his palm pressed firmly against the surface. For a moment, he felt nothing but the smoothness of the stone. Then, faintly, he thought he felt a vibration, a low hum deep within the monolith, as though the sarcophagus itself was alive. He jerked his hand back, his heart racing, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. He forced himself to steady his thoughts. Perhaps it was imagination, the result of exhaustion and the weight of discovery. Yet the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of his reason. He stepped back and studied the sarcophagus once more. There was no visible seam, no lid he could pry open with tools. The builders had sealed it completely, as though determined that no one should ever disturb what lay within, and yet Daniel felt certain that it was meant to be opened, not by just anyone, but by someone who had reached this point, who had passed through the treasures and the hall of devotion to stand before it. His gaze returned to the carvings, searching for meaning. Many of the symbols matched those on the pendant he had seen in the hall. The thought struck him suddenly. Perhaps the pendant was more than an ornament, more than a symbol of power. Perhaps it was the key. The realization made his skin prickle. He had left it behind, afraid to take it, but he could feel its absence now like an ache. Without it, the sarcophagus was a riddle he could not solve. Daniel sank to his knees before the monument, exhaustion and awe mingling in his veins. The enormity of the moment weighed upon him. He was alone in a chamber that no living soul had seen for thousands of years, standing before the sarcophagus of a forgotten ruler, or perhaps something even more enigmatic. The treasures in the hall had been dazzling, but they were only the surface, the outer skin of the pyramid's secret. Here lay the core, the truth entombed in silence. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the people who had built this place, their hands placing the final stone, their voices raised in chants that had long since faded into the desert wind. Did they believe they were preserving glory, or hiding a danger too great for the world to know? When he opened his eyes, the sarcophagus loomed above him, implacable and silent. He felt both reverence and defiance, torn between the urge to honor its secrecy and the compulsion to uncover what it hid. His rational mind whispered of archaeological integrity, of patience and study, of bringing experts who could preserve the site properly. But his heart beat with a different rhythm, one that cried for discovery, for the breaking of boundaries, for the unveiling of truth no matter the cost. He rose slowly, brushing dust from his knees, and pressed his hands once more against the cold stone. His voice, hoarse from disuse, echoed softly in the chamber as he whispered, "What are you hiding?" The words vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the silence, but he thought he heard the faintest echo, a sound that did not belong to him. Daniel staggered back, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. The chamber felt alive now, as though the very walls leaned closer, waiting for his decision. He knew he could not remain here much longer without returning for the pendant. Whatever secret the sarcophagus held, it was bound to that artifact, and without it, he could go no further. But the thought of leaving, even for a moment, tore at him. He wanted to know, needed to know, what lay within. He stood there for a long time, caught between reverence and obsession, the lantern flickering as though it, too, felt the weight of the decision. At last, he turned reluctantly towards the passage, his step slow and heavy. The sarcophagus remained behind him, its golden veins glimmering faintly as though mocking his retreat. He knew he would return, pendant in hand, ready to face whatever truth the pyramid had buried. As he emerged once more into the corridor, Daniel felt the silence of the chamber cling to him like a shadow. He was not the same man who had entered the pyramid's heart. He carried with him the weight of history, the promise of revelation, and the gnawing dread that some truths were not meant to be uncovered. Yet, he also carried the certainty that he would return. The sarcophagus had not released him, it had claimed him. And in the darkness of the golden pyramid, the secret of the past waited, patient and unyielding. For the moment, he would dare to unlock it. Daniel emerged from the corridor as if stumbling back into a different world, the hall of treasures greeting him with its eerie stillness. The glow of his lantern brushed once more across the golden masks and statues, but they no longer held the same spell over him. They were dazzling, yes, but they felt now like guardians, distractions set to test his resolve before the heart of the pyramid. His mind burned with the vision of the black sarcophagus, its golden veins glimmering like veins of fire, its presence overwhelming. It had not been enough to see it. He felt the weight of its silence commanding him to return, and finish what he had begun. And yet, he knew with a clarity that gnawed at his conscience that opening it might mean more than uncovering relics. It might mean trespassing against something deliberately buried, something meant never to be touched again. The pendant on the central pedestal pulsed faintly, its light unchanged, steady as a heartbeat. Daniel walked toward it slowly, his boots crunching softly against the dust of centuries. He had avoided it before, fearful of claiming what seemed too sacred, but now he understood. The markings on the sarcophagus, the resonance he had felt when his hand touched the black stone, all of it pointed here. This object was no trinket. It was the key, and without it, the pyramid's deepest secret would remain sealed. His hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the pendant. It felt unnaturally smooth, the mineral glowing faintly as though alive beneath his touch. He lifted it carefully from its pedestal. The weight surprised him. It was heavier than it appeared, as though it carried not only its own mass, but the burden of centuries. For a moment, he thought he heard something stir in the chamber, a faint rustle, a sigh of air that had no source. He held the pendant tightly, his heart hammering, and told himself it was only his imagination. But deep inside, he felt that by taking it, he had awakened something that had waited patiently for this moment. When he returned to the chamber of the sarcophagus, the darkness greeted him like an old adversary. The black stone loomed at the center, silent and eternal, yet somehow expectant, as though it had felt the pendant's return. Daniel approached slowly, holding the glowing artifact before him, and the carvings along the sarcophagus seemed to shimmer faintly in response. His pulse raced as he placed the pendant against the golden vein running across the lid. The air trembled. A faint vibration rose through the floor, humming against his boots, and the chamber filled with a low sound that seemed to come from the stone itself. Daniel staggered back, eyes wide. The sarcophagus glowed faintly along its seams, golden light seeping out as though the stone were alive. The pendant pulsed in his hand, its colors swirling, and the air grew heavy, charged with something he could not name. His breath came shallow, his heart pounding with fear and exhilaration. He was close, closer than anyone in history had ever been, to the truth locked within this ancient monument. But, as the glow intensified, another thought struck him with terrifying clarity. The builders had not hidden this place in error. They had buried it deep beneath the sands, sealed it with gold, guarded it with symbols and offerings, because what it contained was not meant to be found. They had not built a shrine merely to honor a king or a god. They had built a prison. If he opened it, he would not only uncover history, he might unleash what they had sought to bury forever. He sank to his knees, clutching the pendant, torn between two hungers. One was the hunger of discovery, the dream of a man who had spent his life feeling small, yearning for proof that he could leave a mark on the world. The other was the hunger of caution, the knowledge that some secrets, once revealed, could never be undone. The chamber seemed to press in on him, the silence louder than any voice, demanding a choice. He closed his eyes, breathing heavily, his thoughts spiraling. He imagined what would happen if he revealed the pyramid to the world. Teams of scientists, governments, and treasure hunters descending upon it, tearing it apart for profit or power. He imagined headlines bearing his name, his discovery etched into history, but he also imagined the ruin it might bring. Would the treasures be melted down, the sacred halls stripped bare, the sarcophagus broken open without reverence? Would the secret be desecrated in pursuit of greed? Then he imagined leaving it hidden, sealing the entrance behind him, carrying the truth only in his memory. The thought crushed him. He had not endured sleepless nights, back-breaking labor, and the weight of isolation to turn away now. And yet, as he stared at the glowing seams of the sarcophagus, the golden light spilling into the chamber, he felt as though the pyramid itself was warning him. Daniel rose slowly, his legs unsteady, and stepped closer. He placed the pendant against the stone once more, the hum growing louder, the glow intensifying until it painted his face in shades of gold. His hand shook, sweat dripping from his brow. One push, one final act, and the sarcophagus would yield its truth. His heart thundered in his chest, every instinct screaming both to continue and to flee. For a long moment, he stood frozen between two futures. In one, he would know. In the other, he would walk away. The weight of both pressed upon him until he thought he might collapse. He whispered aloud, his voice hoarse, "Am I meant to do this?" The chamber gave no answer, only the steady pulse of the pendant and the hum of the stone. The light flared suddenly, blinding him, and Daniel cried out, stumbling back. The pendant slipped from his hand and clattered against the stone floor, its glow dimming to a faint ember. The sarcophagus shuddered once, then stilled, the golden veins fading until they were only cold lines in the black stone. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, as though nothing had ever happened. Daniel sank to the floor, his chest heaving, staring at the unyielding monument. His chance had come and passed, leaving him shaken and uncertain. He did not know whether he had been tested, warned, or spared. The choice still loomed over him, unsolved, and the pyramid seemed content to wait, patient as the desert itself, for the day he would decide. When he finally left the chamber, lantern in one hand and the faintly glowing pendant in the other, Daniel felt the weight of the world pressing down upon him. The treasures, the carvings, the sarcophagus, they were no longer simply discoveries. They were burdens, secrets too heavy for one man to carry, yet too dangerous to share. He emerged into the desert night with the stars glittering above him, their cold light indifferent to his turmoil. The pyramid slept once more beneath the sands, its mysteries intact, its silence unbroken. Daniel knew he would return. He could never truly walk away, but for now the final truth remained sealed. The desert had given him a glimpse, a taste of revelation, but the ultimate secret of the Golden Pyramid still waited in darkness, daring him to decide whether he was willing to pay the price of knowing. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't leave just yet. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable discovery. Want more secrets buried in history? Check out the other videos waiting for you right here. And share this one with your friends. Let's see who dares to uncover the mystery with you.